Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. I rise to make a Senator's statement on overcoming Indigenous disadvantage. In Western Australia, at this stage last week, we heard Premier Barnett talk about his intention to close up to 150 Aboriginal communities. And then also just this week we've heard that the Kimberley Interpreting Service, which is a vital service that provides interpreters to a number of forums in the Kimberley and in fact beyond the Kimberley, but in particular they play a very important role in providing interpreting services to the justice system, of which we know that it's very important that Aboriginal people have access to those services. They have experts in over 30 languages, and they provide essential services to Aboriginal people as they appear in court. Because we have known, and I've in fact met with them on numerous occasions, have in fact used their services and heard how important their role is in the way that they are able to present information to the court. And I've heard on occasions where people have in fact had an adverse outcome because they have in fact not been able to understand what's been going on in the justice system. So it's in that context that I felt that I needed to make a Senator's statement about these issues. And today, of course, we see the release of the Productivity Commission's Overcoming Indigenous Disadvantage 2014 report. And it makes, while we have seen some improvement in life expectancy, young child mortality, which is of course very important, Year 12 attainment, post-secondary achievement and income levels, we cannot take that as being a success when you look at what hasn't happened. And the point being there too, in that the gap in life expectancy and those other measures are not going to enable us to meet the target that we've set ourselves in closing the gap within a generation. So although there has been some slight improvement, we are not, I repeat, not on track to closing the gap in life expectancy and other areas in our commitment. But the areas that have got worse are mental health, suicide and self-harm, incarceration rates, access to clean water, power and sewage. It's 2014 and we've gone backwards in access to clean water, power and sewage. There's been no change in the reading, writing and numeracy area, disability and chronic disease, family and community violence, and it's unclear on employment, early childhood education, child abuse and neglect, obesity and nutrition. This is despite our efforts to close the gap and commitment to that. It's quite obvious that we aren't meeting our commitments with appropriate programs. We have funding in Australia for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander programs, quite frankly, in a mess. We have had the government come in and cut over $500 million worth of funding out of programs. But that funding wasn't done in a let's have a look at what's working and fund what's working or not. It's let's narrow all the programs down, put them into some broadbanded areas and then get everybody to put in and apply for funding. We'll extend some of the funding in the short term while everybody then applies. And what's happened is we've had over, I think it's 3,400 applications for a limited amount of money. Organisations don't know if their programs are going to continue or not. There's somehow some belief that the good ones will rise to the top and they're the ones that will get funded, rather than looking at if you're going to fund some into the future and if the government's going to make a cut, and no way do I support that cut. It is appalling to think that we've seen this report that talks about how things are getting worse and there's been no change, we don't know what's happening, and the government has cut $500 million out. But if you're going to cut $500 million out, you actually do it sensibly. You just don't slash ad hoc in an ad hoc manner. But of course we've also seen cut to legal services. We have appallingly high incarceration rates of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, and not only has it increased for men, but alarming the increase for women, and absolutely appalling overrepresentation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people in the youth detention system. And we know that engagement in that is likely to lead to further engagement as they become adults. But so what has this government done? Cut legal services. And they have this absolutely flawed commentary that it's not going to cut frontline services, but everybody knows that it has. Family and community violence has got worse. What's the government done? Cut the funding to those programs. Completely flawed approach. 150 communities just in Western Australia. There's others likely to happen as well, but just in Western Australia, the Barnett government has now indicated they'll be cutting up to 150 communities. We all know what that dislocation will mean to the people that have to leave those communities: homelessness, the associated issues that go with homelessness, access. There's appalling outcomes for people that are living on the outskirts of town, living in the long grass. We know that. So that is only going to increase the appalling outcomes that we're seeing already. And the Barnett government says that's because the federal government is only giving them $90 million to take over responsibilities for the services in some of these towns. So my question is, why did he sign that in the first place, when he knew very well that those 150 communities would likely to be closed because there was not enough money? The Commonwealth also is not blameless here in the fact that they only were prepared to offer $90 million. They must have known full well that that would not deliver the sorts of services that people living in these remote communities need. It's quite clear from this that measures like the intervention haven't worked. We haven't seen a turnaround here in terms of incarceration rates, in terms of access to the sorts of services and supports that Aboriginal communities need. That, again, is a top-down approach that takes control away from communities, control away from people to make decisions over their own lives, and importantly has not delivered community-appropriate, culturally appropriate, community-driven programs. We need to be carefully looking at the outcomes of this report to see how we can better invest the money, and throwing all of the funding up for whoever wants to put in applications, and they were given a very short amount of time. So I know from talking to organisations that what they did is just put in a whole lot of applications applications that covered a whole lot of areas because they didn't know what was going to happen as a result of this process. I've also had reports where they know funding is going to be cut for very good programs. One service in Broome told me how they were extremely concerned about the ongoing future for the program in terms of financial support and counselling, because the money that would normally have been used for one region, one area, has now been stretched over a whole region. In other words, a cut to those important financial services. Emotional and social wellbeing programs that underpin a lot of the work that Aboriginal medical services do is being cut. And so I've had two Aboriginal medical services in Western Australia say to me, one thinks they're going to lose about $800,000, another $700,000. That blows an enormous hole in their budget, which of course then undermines the programs they can deliver that address things like chronic disease and disability. And then you've got the issues about employment. And what is this government doing? Outsourcing the process on that to a billionaire who, in the form of Andrew Forrest, because of course he'd know more than the experts know. And what's he also come up with? The brilliant idea about the healthy welfare card, when income management plainly is not working in the NT. Taking decision-making over money, making a so-called cashless society, will not address the underlying causes and the fundamental issues that we need to deal with in Aboriginal disadvantage. And this government, when they had the opportunity at the beginning of the year to commit to reduce incarceration rates, muffed it. They did not commit to a justice target when Aboriginal organisations have been almost begging the government to put in place a justice target for closing the gap. This government didn't do it. No, we'd bring in the populist approach to a target for school attendance, but the government won't address a justice target. That's a start to addressing incarceration rates. We need more. This is a terrible report card, and Australia needs to do better.
Thank you, Senator Seward.